Welcome to the Educational Physics Podcast. I am your host, João Figueiredo. This podcast is all about education, pedagogy, mindset, and really any other nonsense that I think about during the week. Enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the Educational Physics Podcast. Today I would like to continue the conversation on language. I started last week discussing this idea of what language is and what's it for. I would like to take the conversation today one step further and discuss how language really affects people in real life situations, how it allows or stops them from developing a functional emotional landscape. Chomsky's idea on universal grammar and how we are able to identify and distinguish language from just noise, which I touched on in the previous episode already. And of course, the importance of self-talk and how language plays a role in the way we think. To start with, I would like to address the idea of self-talk. We all think using language. This is not a new idea. Noam Chomsky became quite well known for pushing this idea forward and really defending the principle that language is a device for thought rather than just a device for communication. And that even quite possibly the origin story of language itself was precisely as a thought mechanism, a way for us to interact with ourselves. And we know that we all have these different voices in our heads and they play different parts and they play different roles. And it's quite important to understand not only what kind of language each one of those parts use, because it is different. And at the end of the day, understanding the language, the dialect even, which is another interesting concept here that we can explore, will allow us to really understand ourselves much more deeply, I would say. If you analyze yourself, if you pay attention to who's talking inside your head, which character is performing at any given moment, you will be able to much more easily identify where that character, that persona, that avatar came from, what its role is, why and what triggers it. And then, of course, you will be able to select and interact with the different parts of you in a much more functional way. So say, for example, if you understand that there's an emotion that gets triggered by a certain situation, and then you realize that that emotion is embodied, which is more often than not what happens in our brains, in our minds anyway. Those emotions become characters. So in other words, emotions arise and then we attach a certain narrative to the emotion. And that's perfectly normal and reasonable, and we all do it. Now, what's important to do and understand is how to then navigate the different characters. That's self-talk. And some of this self-talk is more or less conscious. Some of it is not. But when you're talking to yourself, you can also perform the exercise of listening to the conversation. So you can create yet another character who is more of a listener, an observer. That would be classed as a form of mindfulness. The conversation is happening in your head, and then you perform this exercise of also becoming a third party that merely observes and tries to understand the conversation. Many people believe that character, that part of you that only listens and then sort of assesses the situation more or less in an unbiased fashion is called the self. I truly believe that if we listen carefully to the way we speak to ourselves, we will realize a couple of different things. One, more often than not, we are not very kind to ourselves unnecessarily and inefficiently, I would even say, but I'll get into that in a minute. The other part here, the other element here, is that you will realize that most of the time you're not fully aware of where these voices come from, and more often than not, they're not really your voices. They sound like it's you, but it's someone else's voice imprinted into your self-talk. That could be a parent, a teacher, whoever. Someone who's made an impression upon you, which is not necessarily just negative. This could be a positive impression. How many of us, I definitely identify myself with being someone who had role models as I was growing up, and I would kind of behave like them. I would kind of speak like them, and that's happening not just outwardly, it's also happening inside. The self-talk becomes a bit of an emulation of what you think that person, that role model, would speak as or behave like. The other aspect is that the wording we choose plays a massive role in the way we face a situation. So I can give you a few examples even. In my job, I teach people how to play music, but like I always say, my main focus is really to help people learn better. I try to support them in that journey, and one of the things, of course, that everyone needs to deal with is failure, and that's difficult sometimes. It's frustrating, and that frustration can be very useful in the process of learning. But many of us are wired or are conditioned to, once frustration hits, we want to quit. And I see this all the time in my line of work. And one of the things that I say to my students is that allow yourself to make mistakes. Don't interrupt the process because you're anticipating a mistake. That's one thing, and that's a self-talk situation. Because they are anticipating a mistake that hasn't been made yet. Who's anticipating that mistake? That part of them that's scared of failing. That's self-talk. So being okay with making mistakes is crucial. And if you feel like giving up even before you made the mistake, you need to stop for a second and just ask yourself, okay, what am I scared of? Is it judgment? Is it humiliation? Is it of starting something that I can't finish? Like I'm going to start an exercise, but it is going to be so difficult that I won't be able to even finish. All of these thoughts that I just verbalized, that's self-talk. And it's very possible to overcome this. The way to do that, in my opinion, is by creating protocols, linguistic protocols. So, and at first I would even write this down on a piece of paper and put it up on a wall so you can see it, especially when you need it. So say, for example, that you're studying for an exam. And it's hard work. You're going to have to do a lot of reading, note-taking, summarizing, etc., etc. And you know that at times you will feel like procrastinating. You can't really give up. I mean, you can, but most people wouldn't give up or quit or just not show up for the exam. But they will procrastinate so much that, of course, they're consuming precious time doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing. if they want to be prepared for that exam. Now, that procrastination is not laziness. It's fear. It's fear of failure, and we actually end up self-sabotaging because we're scared of failing. So that becomes, or then it becomes useful to have indeed some sort of linguistic protocol. So listen to your self-talk, try to become mindful of it, and if you find yourself thinking or saying things such as "this is too difficult, I can't do it," try to start to replace those things with more proactive ideas or words. For example, "I can't do this yet." Yet is a very powerful word because it sees immediately takes away the forever feel, right? Like, I can't do it. It sounds very forever. I will never be able to do this. I can't do it yet is realistic because you can't do it. That's true. But it adds a promise of a better future with the yet. Now, then you need to of course, also negotiate with yourself what you have to do in order to make that yet a reality as well. Because yes, you can't do it. That's fine. I can't do a bunch of stuff. But if I want to learn how to do those things, I have to allow myself to have that beginner's mindset where I'm gonna just allow myself to learn and immerse myself in the process of learning it. And B, I also need to be able to work out how to get there, how to understand the processes, the mechanics of learning this new thing. I'm gonna have to be comfortable with making mistakes. I'm gonna have to be comfortable with seeking out advice. So I can't do it yet. Okay, now that you have the yet, you need to work out the methods or the mechanics of how you're gonna get to where you want to get to. So if you're practicing or studying for an exam, then okay, let's recap studying techniques. Let's maybe seek out advice. Let's talk to a course mate or a schoolmate. Go talk to a teacher. Take the proactive steps that will take you from frustration to action and then results. And it can, as silly as it might sound, it can start with a yet. If you're someone who's even more aggressive with your self-talk, and especially negative self-talk, and you start saying things like, "I'm stupid, this is just me, I can't do these things, I never can," like if you start with nevers and forevers and "I can't do it, and because it's me, I'm uniquely flawed." I taught a lot of people like this. It might sound like I'm being dramatic, but I have taught lots of students who behave like this, who against themselves all the time, constantly self-attacking. What you have to, first of all, if you're an educator, I'll give you two angles here. If you're an educator, what you have to do is you got to help them navigate that self-talk by asking them to stop, to cease talking, thinking, acting. Because these might be just the signs of overwhelm. And we start to become emotional because we are becoming overwhelmed by the demand of the task. So just ask them to stop, take a breather, relax, take a deep breath, exhale, a couple more. Just guide them through that process of knowing when to stop. That's a very important tool if you're, or the person you're trying to teach is prone to heightened frustration, right? It's not just like I'm frustrated, but I'm going to keep on going, but really like anxiety and a bit of a panic around learning and demanding tasks. So teach them first how to stop. Then help them reframing their thoughts. Okay, if they're saying, "Oh, I can't do this. Oh, I know I'm gonna mess this up." Okay, just why? Ask them why. Just justify what you're saying to me. And more often than not, that the person will struggle to justify it, and that's quite eye-opening for them, because they will realize that, okay, I don't know why. It's just a feeling. Okay, I appreciate the feeling, right? Again, now playing the role of the educator. You tell them you appreciate that it is difficult. And then you can either make it relatable, you can talk to them about the times you struggled and you said silly things about yourself, and then you proved yourself wrong. And so can they. So then we make a pact. And again, you can write this stuff down and put it up on the wall. Don't accept any thoughts that you can't justify. Now, even that's a little dangerous. There's a caveat there, because the brain is fantastic at coming up with rationalizations, which is another linguistic self-talk tool, right? The brain, again, like I said earlier, an emotion arises and then a narrative shows up with it, after it. First the emotion, then the narrative attaches itself to it, and this is how we come up with rationalizations. This is how we come up with egos. This is how we come up with different characters that play different roles in our mindscape, and it's often an inglorious journey to work out who's talking. Is it worth listening to this voice? There's so many things to dissect and process in real time. It takes a lot of practice. And you're not always going to be successful at selecting the right voice to listen to. But the reality is that without practice, you won't be able to achieve end results. So then, if you accept that principle that I should not accept any thoughts that I can't justify, then you need to also accept the next principle, which is I have to be willing to question my reasons. And that's the next step. Because otherwise, like I said, how do you know you're not just rationalizing a reason that will, quote unquote, justify not doing, not pursuing, not insisting, not persevering, right? All of that, it's going to have to be challenged. So language works inside as well as works outside. Of course, there's so many things we wouldn't say to other people. I know of a lot of people who are somewhat good at giving out advice, but they don't follow it. As the old saying goes, wisdom is to follow your own advice. And the importance of that is also in the understanding that we do understand the power and structure of language. We understand it, otherwise we wouldn't have a filter for what we say out loud versus what we think inside. We understand that language has a lot of power. So in the privacy of our skull, we say the most ridiculous, offensive, insulting, demeaning, sometimes unjustifiably complimentary as well. But we say the most outrageous things. And then when we speak out loud, we tone it down a lot. Why? Because we know the power of language. We understand that there's a lot at stake attached to words. And how do we know that? How do we understand intrinsically that power of language? To the point that we find language an essential device for being human. And how do we know that language is language? How do I know when I'm listening to a foreign language How can I discern that although I don't understand anything that I'm being told, if it's not a language I speak, I still know it's a language? And this is Noam Chomsky's idea of universal grammar. This idea that all languages around the world, all of them, have the same sort of structure or components anyway. There would be a verb, there would be a subject, there's a certain emphasis put on intonation, there's a certain emphasis put onto phrasing, and not to forget how our body language and facial expressions are attached to what we are saying and what the intent of what we're saying is, right? Without even knowing the language, I can sort of work out if someone is asking me a question by the look on their faces. And this is all very important for us educators, parents, and students, because it gives us so much more language, so much more vocabulary even to work with, because then we have the spoken language, the non-spoken language that the students and ourselves, of course, keep inside our skulls, the body language, which of course includes all the millions of combinations of facial expressions that humans are capable of performing. And all of that plays a role into how people express themselves to themselves, and then of course how they map out the world and how they create these emotional landscapes depending on what words they use and what emotional value they attach to the word. An example of that is the word hate. So the word hate is, we would all agree that it's a very strong word. And yet, a lot of people say things like, oh, I hate this soup. Well, that's not really hate appropriate, in my opinion, because I attach a really strong baggage. I have like the emotional baggage attached to the word hate for me is quite strong. I like to keep that word intense, and I don't use it. I simply don't use the word hate. I wouldn't call it a forbidden word, but I save it for when I really feel it. And I'm not gonna lie, I haven't felt that emotion frequently in my life. I just haven't. And for me, the way I worked out the intensity that I wanted to assign to the word, and that's a very important factor here. It's the intensity that you wish to attribute to the word. For me, it was very simple. Hate is the antagonist for love. And love for me is an extremely intense word. So hate must be an extremely intense word if it's going to be the antagonist. And that gave both those words a very special place, love and hate. So when I express love for something, I really feel it. So again, would I say I love this soup? Do I care about soups that much? But if I'm saying I love my son, oh, that's heartfelt. If I say I love teaching, I mean that, right? There's only so many things that I can deposit love upon, and likewise, the same goes for hate. And my, I don't know, I guess my mission in life is to have way less things that deserve hate than those that deserve love. But even the loved ones will be pretty exclusive. And that way, I've created an emotional landscape, as I call it, which is predicated upon the words that I use to describe emotions and things and people. Just like I mentioned in the previous episode, I didn't really know the meaning of the word anxiety, or at least not with the emotional baggage that it seems to have in Britain. And that's very common. We talked about certain cultures not having a word for grief. And I believe in Nigeria, there's no word for sadness. And it's quite interesting to understand, like, okay, what does that mean then? How does that limit your human experience? Or does it at all? Does the lack of a word limit your human experience? Or does the way you use words, even if you have them at your disposal in the language that you speak, if you choose not to use those words or to use them very exclusively, very cautiously, does that limit or does that expand, conversely, your human experience? My belief is that yes. Although we still do feel all those emotions, such as grief or sadness, can someone from Tahiti experience grief the same way that we can? No, they can't, because the lack of the word actually leaves them with finding other words that could somewhat express the feeling, but they end up, like I said in the previous episode, referring to grief as feeling sick. The reality is that words play a massive role in the way we experience, describe, and interpret the world. Emotional landscape design is extremely fundamental, and this is something that children do the moment they start talking, the moment they start understanding speech, even before they can talk. They start to map out the world according to language, because emotions come with a narrative attached to them. And as we grow older, as a child develops into an adult, the complexity of our language increases, and so does the complexity of our emotional landscape. And that's extremely important, because it's going to really explain to us why we see people who we can clearly tell that they have different outlooks on life. They speak differently. They use different words. They have a different cadence. They don't use certain words. And there's a lot to be said about that. The reality is that language is a powerful device, and we should all become aware of its limits, its uses, how we can take the best out of the devices we have, make it functional, proactive, beneficial. At the end of the day, language must serve us from a survival standpoint and an evolutionary standpoint. This is a human creation that we need to use to our benefit. Biologically, that makes sense. Evolutionarily, that makes sense. And the reason why we don't do that is because we are also evolutionarily wired to recognize negativity more than positivity. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward. Negativity might mean, from an evolutionary standpoint, danger. And danger is something that we need to pay attention to. When all goes well, we can just be mindful and live in the moment. But danger can mean that you might hurt yourself. It might mean that you can lose something precious. It might mean that you're gonna die. So of course we are wired to be impacted by negativity a lot more frequently, and a lot more intensely. So our language also reflects that. People have more negative self-talk than positive self-talk. Yes, of course, because we are biologically, genetically designed to identify and pay more attention to danger and to negative environments, and that makes us more alert. So there's a bit of a battle there, because that heightened state makes us feel more attentive and more present and more capable of assessing situations, but it makes us pessimistic or negative or depressed. So we need to play a very cautious game there of finding the sweet spot between speaking to ourselves in functional, pragmatic, proactive ways that are positive, because positivity is proactive, while still allowing for frustration to play its role. Mistakes are not quote unquote positive, even from, again, an evolutionary perspective. Mistakes are negative. It's negative outcome. But then what we do with them is what we call progress, which evolutionarily is a positive outcome. That is evolution in a nutshell. It's the constant tweaking, the constant correction. And language plays a massive role in that constant correction for human beings. You can start that correction today by changing the words you use, the tone you use, how you speak to yourself, what you write down on a piece of paper, the protocols that you use to override negative self-talk. All of that is at your disposal. So use it wisely, your language, your words, and you'll see your emotions changing and adapting. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. Subscribe, like, and comment, and I will see you guys next week. Take care.